Thanks to SimpliSafe for sponsoring today's episode. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers identifications, reasonable suspicion, and the right to film, and is brought to us by Trey Citizens channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. Before we dive into the interaction, I want to give a big thanks to the sponsor of this episode, SimpliSafe. A few months ago, my family came home from vacation to discover our front door wide open and several valuable items missing from the house. The stuff that was taken was easily replaced, but our family's sense of security wasn't so easy to get back. That's where today's sponsor, SimpliSafe, made a big difference in our lives. SimpliSafe offers comprehensive security for your entire home, with advanced sensors and cameras designed to detect threats from break-ins, floods, fires, and a ton of other situations. With SimpliSafe's exclusive 24/7 live guard protection, SimpliSafe's expert agents act within 5 seconds of receiving an alarm signal, rapidly assessing the situation and taking immediate steps to ensure your family's safety. And with the use of the smart alarm indoor camera, these agents can even see and speak to intruders in real time, acting as a deterrent while they contact the proper authorities to handle the situation. Unlike traditional home security systems, SimpliSafe never locks you into a convoluted long-term contract or charges hidden fees. SimpliSafe earns your business by keeping you safe and satisfied, not by locking you into ridiculous contracts. SimpliSafe products are easy to install, reliable, and a fraction of the cost of competing brands. And right now, SimpliSafe is offering members of the ATA community 20% off on your system purchase and 1 month of Fast Protect monitoring free when you visit simplisafe.com/audit. Give yourself and your family some peace of mind and visit simplisafe.com/audit today. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. Thanks again to SimpliSafe for sponsoring today's episode. On Wednesday, June 15th, 2016, First Amendment Auditor Deontay Valentine was filming in a public parking lot for the Municipal Court and Police Department buildings in Greer, South Carolina, when he was approached by Corporal Shirata of the Greer Police Department. Mr. Valentine continued to film the encounter that followed and later shared it on his YouTube channel.
No reason, really.
How are you today?
What's your name and badge number?
I'm Corporal Shradd of the Greer Police Department. How are you?
I'm alright.
Okay. Is there any reason why you're videotaping? I'm just curious. You're not in any kind of trouble. There's nothing here other than we got called and told that you were walking around the parking lot. So, any particular reason for it? No, you're not going to answer? So we're just going to have a stare off because I'm recording you and you're recording me? Is that what we're going to do? Do you have your ID on you?
Have I done anything wrong?
Well, you're recording a suspicious activity, which puts this into a category of suspicious activity, which means that Terry versus Ohio, I can detain you until I can determine or deny that there's criminal activity.
Terry v. Ohio says suspicious activity is not enough for reasonable cause for ID.
There's already a call on it, so yes.
So suspicious activity, is that a felony or misdemeanor?
That's a misdemeanor.
No, it's not.
Yes, sir.
And I can't believe you just sat here and lied.
Yep, go ahead and give me your ID.
Can you call your supervisor to the scene?
I am a supervisor.
I need another one.
Okay.
I need a lieutenant or somebody else.
Okay.
Corporal Shirata asks for Mr. Valentine's ID, and Mr. Valentine does not comply, requesting a supervisor instead. South Carolina does not have a so-called stop and identify law that requires individuals to identify themselves to police officers under certain circumstances, and the state hindering and resisting statutes found in Section 16-5-50 and Section 16-9-320 of the South Carolina Code are limited to situations involving arrests and the service of legal process. However, Section 62 82-116 of the Greer Code of Ordinances states that, quote, "It shall be unlawful for any person within the city limits by any act, physical or verbal, to resist any law enforcement officer in the discharge of his duty with the intent to hinder or impede such officer in the discharge of his duty." Now, while it is possible that a court could conclude that this ordinance applies to individuals who refuse to identify themselves, as we have discussed before on ATA, the Supreme Court held in the 1979 case of Brown versus Texas that individuals cannot be punished for refusing to identify themselves to officers who do not have any reasonable suspicion to believe they are engaged in criminal conduct. And although the Supreme Court upheld the constitutional validity of stop and identify statutes in the 2004 case of Heibel versus 6th Judicial District Court of Nevada, as the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has jurisdiction over South Carolina, explained in the 2021 case of Wingate versus Fulford, quote, "Read together, Brown and Heibel illustrate that a valid investigatory stop, supported by Terry-level suspicion, is a constitutional prerequisite to enforcing stop and identify statutes. In other words, individuals may only be arrested for refusing to identify themselves in situations where officers have reasonable suspicion to believe they are involved in criminal activity. Importantly, as the Fourth Circuit clarified in the Wingate case, quote, "Officers may always request someone's identification during a voluntary encounter, but they may not compel it by threat of criminal sanction. Accordingly, in this situation, Mr. Valentine could not be criminally punished for refusing to identify himself unless a court concluded that the officers had the reasonable suspicion necessary to constitutionally detain him."
Actually, I'll go and do this type of thing.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
I'm just curious.
I mean, hey.
Criminal activity, there's nothing to worry about.
So why are you asking for my ID then?
Because you're not answering me, and when you're not answering me, how do I know you're not filming this parking lot to come shoot it up?
It's called the Fifth Amendment, right?
So I can check on that if it's suspicious, and the part of that checking is to identify you. So if I can get
It's suspicious, a felony or misdemeanor.
Hey, sir. Again.
Name, badge number?
Sergeant Forrester, 301.
All right, how you doing?
Good. How can I help you?
Well, he contacted me. He wanted my ID for no reason, so I need a supervisor to let him know that, without any crime being committed, I don't have to present my ID.
Well, he actually got a call on you.
Well, what crime have I committed?
Well, anytime somebody calls in and reports suspicious activity,
It's suspicious of felony or misdemeanor.
it's neither one, but he asked.
Okay, thank you. So he said it was a misdemeanor. So now we have a conflict on which one it is.
Sergeant Forrester implies that Corporal Sharada had the authority to detain and identify Mr. Valentine because the officers received a call reporting him as suspicious. However, the mere fact that the police receive a call reporting a quote-unquote suspicious person does not on its own give an officer the reasonable suspicion necessary to detain and identify a citizen. Rather, reasonable suspicion is determined based on the specific facts known to an officer at the time of the interaction and whether or not they suggest potential involvement in criminal activity. For instance, in the 2000 case of Florida versus JL, the Supreme Court held that a call reporting that an individual was carrying a gun was insufficient to give rise to reasonable suspicion under the circumstances of the case, despite the fact that the caller provided an accurate description of the suspect's location and appearance. In reaching this conclusion, the court concluded that, quote, "Reasonable suspicion requires that a tip be reliable in its assertion of illegality, not just in its tendency to identify a determinate person. Therefore, while calls reporting quote-unquote suspicious activity may include sufficient information to provide officers with the reasonable suspicion necessary to detain a suspect, there is no blanket rule allowing officers to detain and identify individuals simply because a call was received about them. And a court in this situation would review all of the facts known to the Greer officers at the time of their interaction with Mr. Valentine to determine if they had the reasonable suspicion required to detain and identify him."
We don't have a conflict at all. We have a conflict with
Hold
the
on,
way you're acting,
whoa,
sir.
whoa.
Taping
Whoa.
our parking lot in today's
Whoa.
day and age, that's fine.
Whoa.
That's fine. You ain't got to whoa nothing.
Whoa.
Today,
What's your name and badge number?
my badge number is 201. It's
Whoa.
Lieutenant Holcomb.
Whoa.
Let me have an ID.
This is the intimidation factor right
Let me
here.
have an ID, please.
What crime have I committed?
An
What
ID.
crime have I committed?
An ID.
What crime have I
An
committed?
ID. You're gonna be failure to listen to a law enforcement officer ask you for an ID.
What crime have
You
I
got an
committed?
ID?
What crime have I committed?
Videotaping our parking lot and walking around the police
Is that a
department.
crime?
Yes, sir. Right now, in
It is.
the day and age that we're dealing with, yes, sir, it is a crime.
What crime have I committed today?
Anytime there's a suspicious person.
Is
that's
that a
going
felony
around,
or a misdemeanor?
It's a Let me see
Whoa,
your ID.
whoa.
You got the count of
Whoa.
3 or you're going to jail.
Now you guys see I got
Ready?
one hand on my camera.
1,
Whoa.
2,
Don't shoot
3.
me.
You're under arrest.
Whoa.
Mr. Valentine repeatedly refuses to identify himself, claiming that he is not required to do so because he has not committed a crime, and Lieutenant Holcomb places him under arrest. Now, as we discussed earlier in this episode, in jurisdictions that have passed so-called stop and identify laws, individuals may be punished for refusing to identify themselves to an officer who has reasonable suspicion to believe that they may be involved in criminal activity, regardless of whether or not they have actually committed a crime. Now, while this distinction may seem mostly semantic, it is important for citizens to understand that there may be situations where they are legally obligated to identify themselves despite the fact that they have not committed a crime or engaged in any sort of wrongdoing. This is because reasonable suspicion can stem from even potentially innocent behavior, and the fact that it is later discovered that an individual has not committed a crime does not invalidate reasonable suspicion based on sufficient articulable facts at the time of the detention. Accordingly, although Mr. Valentine was not violating any laws at the time the officers ordered him to identify himself, it is still possible that a court could determine that he could be arrested for refusing to identify himself if the officers had reasonable suspicion to believe that he may have been engaged in criminal activity.
So you got your ID on?
I like everything my picture image, not speaking to anybody, so I can avoid the police.
Guess what? That's not a right.
Actually,
That's a right to stay in jail, because if we don't have an ID and name and everything, then you stay in jail until we figure out who you are. So you can tell us who you are, or you can stay in jail until we
crime
figure it out.
have
Huh? Interfering with the police.
You guys just came to approach me.
Yes, sir. And I asked you for an ID.
And what crime has I committed?
Interfering with the police.
What crime? For you suspended for
Listen to me. Listen to me, because I know you're not deaf.
I don't gotta listen to you.
Interfering with the
I was
police.
not.
Yes, you
I
were.
was not. I do this all the time.
That's fine. Well, guess what? You're going to see the inside of the South Carolina jail.
we got a call that he was walking through the Century Insurance parking lot, in the parking lot. I guess he filmed him when he drove by, so I got out and started talking to him. He wouldn't answer me at all. Just put your hand back. So I said, you're not doing anything wrong at this point if you're just filming, but we got a call on you, suspicious activity. This is what's your reason for doing it, but he wouldn't answer me. What crime have I committed? I said, okay, well now.
Some sort of ID specialist.
And I told him, I said, Terry versus Ohio, now you're being suspicious, so I can detain you and I didn't see your ID.
The officers discuss Mr. Valentine's arrest, and one of them claims that he had reasonable suspicion to detain and identify Mr. Valentine based on his conduct. As we have discussed before here on ATA, the Supreme Court has repeatedly acknowledged First Amendment protections for the so-called right to receive information and ideas, as well as news-gathering activities, such as filming. Additionally, at the time of this encounter, which occurred back in 2016, a handful of federal circuits had recognized that the First Amendment protected the right to film government officials in public. However, the Fourth Circuit did not recognize the right to film police until the 2023 case of Sharp versus Winterville Police Department, where the Court of Appeals held that recording and live streaming a police traffic stop is speech protected by the First Amendment. Nonetheless, it is important to understand that the fact that filming is protected by the First Amendment does not mean that unusual filming activity cannot form the basis for reasonable suspicion. For instance, in the 2017 case of Turner versus Driver, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals granted qualified immunity to officers who detained an individual who was video recording the quote-unquote routine activities at a police station from a public sidewalk across the street, despite also recognizing the existence of a First Amendment right to record the police. In concluding that the officers' detention of the individual was not objectively unreasonable in light of clearly established law, the court reasoned that in light of recent attacks on police officers and police stations and the resulting increase of security at police stations, an objectively reasonable officer could have suspected that the filmer was, now quoting, casing the station for an attack, stalking an officer, or otherwise preparing for criminal activity, and thus could have found filming the routine activities of the station sufficiently suspicious to warrant questioning and a brief detention. Nonetheless, in this situation, Mr. Valentine was filming a public parking lot rather than a police station, and while it is possible that a court could conclude that his activity was sufficiently suspicious to justify his detention, it seems more likely that it would determine that merely filming the parking lot did not give rise to the reasonable suspicion necessary for the officers to detain Mr. Valentine.
What crime have I committed? Didn't have an idea. I'm the one who brought it up. get that point removed from friendly conversations. That's what I'll do too, is because I don't know what's on the cell phone and what he's recording. I think that cell phone should go to that.
That would be a good idea.
Who knows what he's doing?
That's a good idea.
I'm sorry? I've got your phone.
After his arrest, Mr. Valentine was charged with interfering with police and released 2.5 hours later. The outcome of this case is unknown. In response to public outcry regarding the arrest, Greer City Attorney John Duggan released a statement defending the officer's actions. In his statement, Mr. Duggan referenced the Pulse nightclub shooting, which occurred 3 days before Mr. Valentine's arrest in Orlando, Florida, and argued that, now quoting, "It is unfortunate that in this time of heightened security concerns for all of us and for law enforcement agencies in particular, Mr. Valentine chose to do this. It is also regrettable that he chose not to provide his name or address or reveal the reason for his behavior. He could have chosen to provide his name and address and the reason for his actions when questioned by the officers. He also could have notified the department before he started videotaping the area and the reason therefore. Had he chosen to do either, this incident could have been avoided." Mr. Duggan also claimed that the Greer Police Department would use this incident to train its officers on how to properly handle situations like these, and that if Mr. Valentine were to sue, the city and the police department would vigorously defend the lawsuit. It is unclear whether Mr. Valentine filed a complaint, and it does not appear that he initiated a lawsuit. Mr. Valentine has not shared a new audit on his YouTube channel since August of 2016. Overall, the Greer officers get an F for maintaining a hostile and aggressive demeanor throughout the interaction, resorting to authoritarian investigation methods in response to a report of innocuous activity, and ultimately arresting Mr. Valentine for simply exercising his constitutional rights. While it is somewhat understandable that the officers would be concerned about a potential safety issue, particularly given the fact that this encounter occurred in 2016, when officer training and familiarity with First Amendment auditors was far more limited, security concerns do not give officers discretion to violate the constitutional rights of citizens whose innocent actions caused them to become fearful. And while the officers were well within their authority to approach Mr. Valentine and attempt to engage in a consensual encounter with him, when he did not want to answer their questions, they should have chosen to rely on other methods of investigation, rather than demanding his ID when they likely did not have the reasonable suspicion necessary to do so. For instance, the officers could have maintained surveillance on Mr. Valentine and then detained him if his actions provided them with the reasonable suspicion necessary to do so. Instead, the officers resorted to issuing orders for identification, which would have done very little to resolve their security concerns and potentially violated the Constitution in the process. That being said, I truly hope that in the 8 years since this encounter, the Greer Police Department has matured in its understanding of auditors and the First Amendment, and that if an auditor were to film the public parking lot today, the officers would perform more satisfactorily. Mr. Valentine gets an A-, because although he did not seem entirely clear on the fact that individuals can be detained and identified in some situations where they have not committed crimes, he maintained a firm but respectful demeanor throughout the encounter and strongly advocated for his First Amendment rights. Additionally, while a court could potentially determine that he could be arrested for refusing to identify himself under these circumstances, Mr. Valentine would have a strong argument that the officers did not have the reasonable suspicion required to detain and ID him solely because he was exercising his First Amendment right to film in a public parking lot. Although it should be noted that given the precedent at the time of this encounter, if Mr. Valentine had pursued a civil rights lawsuit against the officers for his arrest, it is likely that they would have been granted qualified immunity. Finally, while the outcome of the charge against Mr. Valentine is unknown, if he was ultimately found guilty of interfering with an officer, I strongly believe that such a conviction would have been unnecessary, unreasonable, and unjust. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out my second channel for even more police interaction content.